The invitation on my calendar was simply labeled as a quick alignment check. There were no bullet points, no attachments, and no preparation notes. It was just a blank block of 30 minutes at 9 in the morning, with only my name, the name of the Human Resources representative Chloe, and the name of the new Chief Executive Officer Julian Vance. In my 12 years at Apex Systems, I had seen that exact meeting format deployed at least 20 times. It was never an alignment check. It was the corporate equivalent of an execution, carried out behind soundproof glass with forced smiles and a folder full of standardized severance documents. I walked down the long carpeted hallway of the 5th floor, my boots making no sound against the thick wool. When I opened the door to the conference room, I was not surprised to find the chairs empty except for Chloe, who was nervously aligning a pen with the edge of her notepad, and Julian, who was scrolling through his phone with an air of practiced indifference. I sat down, folding my hands on the polished walnut table. Julian did not look up immediately. He let the silence stretch for a few seconds, a classic power move he had likely read about in a business school case study. He was 34 years old, wore a tailored gray suit without a tie, and had spent his entire career operating in the shadow of his father, Gordon Vance, the founder of our company. Julian had joined us only 18 months prior as the Vice President of Strategic Evolution, a title that meant absolutely nothing but allowed him to attend board meetings. 3 months ago, when Gordon decided to step back due to failing health, the board had quietly installed Julian as the Chief Executive Officer. He had never written a single line of code, never spent a night in a server room during a critical outage, and never spoken to a client who was screaming because their production environment was down. But he had opinions on velocity, synergy, and what he called the fresh cultural vibe of the company. Julian finally put his phone down and offered a tight, professional smile. "Owen, thanks for coming in," he said, his voice carrying the rehearsed cadence of a public speaker. "We have been doing a lot of deep thinking about the future of Apex, especially as we prepare for the next phase of our growth. We are looking at our team structures, our engineering velocity, and where we need to align our resources to stay competitive." He paused, looking to Chloe for support. Chloe cleared her throat, her eyes darting toward the window. "We want to make sure we are fostering an environment of collaborative evolution," she added, reciting the standard human resources playbook. I did not interrupt them. I simply watched Julian, noticing the faint twitch in his jaw. I knew exactly what was coming. 12 years ago, Gordon and I started this company in a damp office space in Cleveland where the ceiling leaked when it rained. And the only heat came from a noisy space heater that tripped the circuit breaker twice a week. I remembered the night in 2011 when I pushed our very first production build to the servers. At 3 in the morning, my eyes burning from coffee and my hands shaking from exhaustion. We had no venture capital back then, no marketing department, and no human resources specialists. We had a product that worked because I built it to work. I had spent a decade refining the core database architecture, writing the routing protocols, and maintaining the systems that now processed millions of transactions a day. I was the one who kept the lights on while Gordon sold the vision. They used to call me the anchor of Apex. But anchors are heavy, and when a new captain wants to sail faster, they often decide to cut the chain. "We feel that your current operational style is no longer aligned with our new methodologies," Julian continued, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. "The engineering team needs leadership that is more agile, more receptive to modern platforms. We require new leadership paradigms. We need to move away from legacy thinking." Legacy thinking. That was the phrase they used when they wanted to replace decades of hard-earned experience with cheaper, younger engineers who would not question their decisions. It was a polite way of saying I was too old, too expensive, and too stubborn to nod along with Julian's superficial initiatives. Chloe reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick envelope. "This is the formal separation agreement," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The termination is effective today." I looked at the envelope but did not pick it up. I did not ask for explanations, and I did not plead for my job. I had seen co-founders thrown out of their own startups before, and I knew that once the decision was made, any display of emotion was just theater. I understand, I said, my voice flat and controlled. I will need an hour to pack my office. Of course, Julian said, his posture relaxing. He had clearly expected a fight, perhaps a speech about loyalty. He did not know how to handle someone who simply accepted the document without a word. We truly appreciate what you did for the company in the early years, Owen, but we have to look forward. I stood up, leaving the envelope on the table. I did not shake his hand. Back in my office, the space felt suddenly unfamiliar. I began packing my personal belongings. I packed a framed photograph of Gordon and me standing in front of our first office, our faces dirty and our smiles wide. I packed a couple of technical books and a small brass clock my father had given me when I graduated from college. On the empty mahogany desk, beside my entry badge, I laid a slim black folder. It contained no labels. Inside was a copy of our founding agreement from 2011, with a specific section marked in yellow highlighter. I knew Julian would not look at it today. He was too busy, but he would find it eventually, or rather his lawyers would. I walked out of the building. The cold November wind hit my face, and for the first time in 12 years, I felt completely quiet. I sat in the driver's seat of my 10-year-old sedan, the heater blowing cold air as the engine slowly warmed up. I placed my laptop on my knees and connected it to my phone's hotspot. My hands were steady, the initial shock of determination replaced by a cold, systematic focus. I opened my personal cloud storage and navigated to a directory I had not accessed in over 5 years. The folder was labeled with the year 2011, containing the legal documents from our incorporation. I opened the file named Shareholder Agreement Draft Final.pdf. My attorney from those early days, a sharp contract specialist named Clara Mercer, had insisted on inserting a protective clause. Back then, Gordon and I were equal partners, but we knew we would eventually have to take investor money to grow. Clara had warned me that venture capitalists and future executives would try to push the technical founder out once the platform was stable. She drafted a provision that we called Article 7. It was a short, dense paragraph buried deep within the investor rights section. It stated that the founding technical officer, defined explicitly by name as Owen Foster, could not be involuntarily terminated from his position without the unanimous written consent of all registered shareholders of the company. If such consent was not obtained prior to termination, the company's license to use the core intellectual property, specifically the proprietary database routing engine I had developed before our first funding round, would immediately revert to my personal ownership. I read the text twice, my eyes scanning the legal definitions. It was still there. Through 3 rounds of funding and 2 capitalization table updates, Article 7 had never been removed. The newer lawyers hired during our Series C round had cleaned up the governance language, but they had assumed the founder protections were standard legacy terms not worth the billable hours to renegotiate. They had ignored it, and Julian Vance had not even bothered to read it. He had simply assumed that because he was the chief executive officer and had the backing of the board of directors, he had the power to fire anyone he pleased. But a board of directors is not the same as the entire shareholder body. I opened my email client and drafted a message to Clara Mercer. I attached the copy of the shareholder agreement, the PDF of my termination letter, which Chloe had emailed to my personal account minutes after the meeting, and a screenshot of the internal announcement Julian had already posted on our company intranet. The subject line read simply, "Activate Article 7." I hit send and watched the progress bar complete. It was done, the mechanism had been triggered, and the gears were now turning. I started the car and drove home, keeping my speed steady. I took the scenic route, wanting to let the reality of the situation settle in. For 12 years, my life had been structured around the daily demands of Apex. I had missed family dinners, canceled vacations, and worked through weekends, all to build a database engine that was now the core value of the company. Now that structure was gone, replaced by a quiet winter afternoon in my own kitchen. 2 days later, the real reason for my sudden termination became public. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee when my phone buzzed with an alert from a major technology news site. The headline read, "Apex Systems enters final negotiations for $220 million acquisition by Vertex Technologies." The article detailed how Vertex, a massive international data management conglomerate, was buying Apex to acquire our proprietary database routing engine, the very engine I had spent 12 years building and maintaining. The deal was Julian's ticket to corporate stardom. It would validate his leadership, make him a multi-millionaire, and cement his reputation as a tech visionary. The acquisition was scheduled to close in 30 days, pending standard due diligence. In the business world, due diligence is the equivalent of a corporate physical exam. The buying company's lawyers and accountants inspect every contract, every debt, every line of code, and every employee file to ensure there are no hidden liabilities. They look for tax issues, pending lawsuits, and, most importantly, clear chain of ownership for the company's intellectual property. Vertex was paying $220 million because they believed Apex owned the database engine lock, stock, and barrel. They did not know that the entire system rested on a foundation of code that was legally tied to a co-founder, who had just been walked out of the building by security. I received a text from Clara Mercer later that afternoon. The text was brief. They received the formal notice. They are trying to call. I did not reply to the text, nor did I answer the 3 phone calls from Apex's general counsel that followed. I did not return the message from Stuart Caldwell, our chief financial officer, who left a voicemail asking if we could meet for lunch to discuss some legacy paperwork. I simply kept my phone on silent and watched the rain run down my kitchen window. I had given 12 years of my life to Apex, working through holidays, missing family dinners, and sacrificing my personal life to build their platform. They had discarded me like an old piece of hardware to make room for a CEO's son. Now, they were about to discover that the code they relied on did not belong to the corporation. It belonged to the man they had fired. The due diligence process for an acquisition of $220 million is a massive machine. It involves dozens of lawyers from prestigious law firms, forensic accountants, and technical auditors who scan every repository. 1 week after the acquisition announcement, the first signs of friction began to appear. In a sleek high-rise office in San Francisco, the legal team representing Vertex Technologies was reviewing the intellectual property portfolio of Apex Systems. The lead counsel for Vertex, a senior mergers and acquisitions specialist named Audrey Ray, was known for her meticulous attention to detail. She had spent the last 15 years working on complex technology integrations, and she could spot a missing signature or an unresolved licensing conflict from a mile away. She did not accept summary sheets. She demanded original documents, wet ink signatures, and complete histories of all core assets. As Audrey's team dug into the technical origin files, they submitted a formal request to Apex's legal department. They wanted to see the original IP assignment agreements from 2011, specifically the documents signed when the company was first formed. At the same time, a junior systems analyst at Vertex named Nisha Patel was running an automated compliance scan on the Apex code repositories. Nisha was looking for open-source licenses and unauthorized third-party libraries. Instead, she found something far more unusual. She discovered a dormant Git repository labeled Core Foundation OM 2011 Backup. Nisha noticed that the repository had a metadata lock on it. Every file in that specific directory was timestamped to the summer of 2011, and the author ID was listed as Owen Foster. More importantly, the system permissions field contained a strict administrative tag, proprietary engineering rights reserved by author. Unlike the rest of the codebase, which was checked in under corporate licenses, this foundational routing logic had never been transferred to the corporate entity. It was locked under a personal developer key. Nisha, assuming this was a technical error or an outdated configuration, flagged the repository and sent a report to her manager. Nisha spent hours looking through the commit logs, tracing the authorship of the core files. She wanted to be absolutely sure that the license header was not just a clerical error before she escalated the issue. She verified the timestamp on each file against the company's early public records, and every query returned the same result. Owen Foster was the sole author and owner of the code. The manager forwarded the report to Vertex's internal legal counsel, who immediately realized the significance of the file. If the foundational routing engine, which processed 90% of Apex's data traffic, was locked under a personal key belonging to a co-founder. Vertex could not claim clear ownership of the technology. They would be buying a company that did not actually own its core product. Audrey Ray placed a call to Apex's general counsel, demanding clarification. At the same time, she sent an email listing 10 specific questions regarding the employment status and IP agreements of Owen Foster. Inside Apex, the reaction was immediate panic. The general counsel, a man who had spent his career handling simple commercial contracts, went straight to Julian Vance's office. He explained that Vertex's lawyers had flagged the early code repository and were asking for proof that Owen Foster had signed away his individual rights to the database engine. He also mentioned that they had found the matte black folder I had left on my desk, which contained the shareholder agreement from 2011. The general counsel had finally read Article 7. His face was pale as he explained the situation to Julian. If Owen Foster was terminated without unanimous investor consent, the IP rights reverted to him. And since Julian had fired Owen without holding a shareholder vote, Apex no longer had the legal right to use or sell the database routing engine. Julian, still convinced that this was just a minor legal technicality, told the general counsel to handle it. Offer him a consulting agreement, Julian said, according to a leak from an assistant who was standing outside the office. Give him $50,000 to sign a retroactive release. He is an engineer. He will take the money. The general counsel tried to explain that $50,000 was nothing compared to a $220 million acquisition, and that Owen Foster had already hired Clara Mercer, one of the most stubborn litigation attorneys in the state. But Julian refused to listen. He was scheduled to appear on a panel at a major technology conference the next morning, and he did not want anything to distract from his moment in the spotlight. He told the legal team to stall Vertex and send a standard release form to Owen's attorney. They had no idea that Clara Mercer had already drafted the formal notice of intellectual property revocation and was waiting for the perfect moment to file it. Over the next 48 hours, the corporate communication channels between Vertex and Apex grew increasingly strained. Audrey Ray sent 3 follow-up emails, copying the lead investors from both sides. She stated that Vertex would suspend the due diligence process entirely unless Apex could provide a signed release from Owen Foster by the end of the week. The general counsel tried to draft a response that minimized the issue, but he knew he was holding a weak hand. The acquisition was on the verge of collapsing, and the executive team was running out of time. The momentum of a major corporate transaction is difficult to stop once it begins. But when it hits a legal barrier, the deceleration is violent. By the middle of the second week, the due diligence calls between Vertex Technologies and Apex Systems had stopped completely. Vertex's legal team had placed a formal hold on the negotiations, citing unresolved compliance issues regarding the ownership of the core database routing engine. The term they used in their official memo was material title defect, a phrase that sent shockwaves through the Apex board of directors. Neil Franklin, the lead investor representing the venture capital firm that held the majority of Apex shares, received a copy of Vertex's hold notice. Neil was a seasoned investor who had funded dozens of tech companies. He remembered the early days of Apex, and he remembered the clause we had written into the original agreement. He knew that I had built the technology that made the company valuable, and he knew that Julian Vance had fired me without consulting the major shareholders. Neil called Julian directly, bypassing the corporate communications team. The conversation was short and tense. Neil demanded an emergency board meeting for the following Monday at 4 in the afternoon. Julian tried to argue that they could resolve the issue with a standard settlement, but Neil refused to listen. You fired the foundation of the company without our consent, Neil said. You created a $90 million liability on a $220 million deal. We are meeting on Monday, and you will have answers. While Julian was trying to manage the board, I met with Clara Mercer at her office downtown. The space was quiet, filled with shelves of legal volumes and the smell of old paper. Clara had prepared the formal complaint for intellectual property infringement, citing federal patent and copyright statutes, specifically Title 17 of the United States Code. She had also drafted a notice of breach of fiduciary duty against Julian Vance and the board members who had participated in the secret termination meeting. "We are not just defending your rights, Owen," Clara said, leaning back in her chair. "We are showing them that they cannot erase the people who built the company. They assumed you would walk away because you are an engineer and not a corporate player. They forgot that the corporate structure only works if they follow the rules they signed." After my meeting with Clara, I walked to a quiet cafe on the corner of the block to meet Harvey Langston, a veteran investigative journalist who covered corporate governance and technology disputes. Harvey had spent 30 years writing about startups, corporate greed, and the founders who were pushed out by venture capitalists. I did not give him internal databases or confidential client records. I simply gave him the public documents: the original incorporation filing from 2011, the text of Article 7, the termination notice signed by Julian Vance, and the public announcements regarding the Vertex acquisition. Harvey took notes in a small pocket ledger, his eyes focused on the details. "This is not just a contract dispute, Owen," Harvey said as he closed his ledger. "This is a case study in how new management destroys value by ignoring the foundation. I will have the article ready by Monday morning." He knew that in the technology industry, a co-founder's rights were the only real protection against a hostile board of directors. And this story was a textbook example of that struggle. The article was published on Harvey's independent news site at 6 in the morning on Monday. It was titled "The Ghost in the Engine: How a Forgotten Clause Could Derail a $220 million Tech Acquisition." By 8, the piece had been shared across every major venture capital network in the country. By 9, the internal Slack channels at Apex were flooded with links to the article. The engineers, who had worked under my direction for years, were realizing that their work was built on technology that the company might no longer own. The sales team was panic-calling clients who had read the report and were asking if their services would be interrupted. The corporate palace Julian had built was beginning to crack, and he was scheduled to face the board in less than 7 hours. As the hours ticked down toward the 4 o'clock board meeting, the panic inside Apex's headquarters was almost tangible. The vice president of operations postponed 3 critical engineering syncs, and the human resources team received 5 separate inquiries from senior staff members asking about the validity of their stock options in the event of an intellectual property dispute. The marketing team, which had been preparing a massive campaign to celebrate the acquisition, was told to freeze all media buys. Julian sat in his office, his blinds drawn, refusing to take calls from anyone except his general counsel. The chessboard was set, and the pieces were moving exactly as Clara Mercer had predicted. Outside the office, the news was spreading rapidly. The local business journal picked up Harvey's story, and 2 industry analysts posted summaries on social media, questioning the maturity of Apex's internal controls. One analyst noted that if the IP dispute went to court, it could freeze the database architecture for months, preventing Apex from deploying new updates or supporting major clients. This was the nightmare scenario for the investors: a public legal battle that would drain the company's cash reserves and render the technology unsellable. The pressure was building, and it was all directed at the CEO's office. The boardroom on the 5th floor was silent when Julian Vance walked in at 4 in the afternoon. The room looked exactly as it had when I was fired, but the atmosphere was completely different. The board members were not looking at their tablets. They were looking at Neil Franklin, who sat at the end of the table, with a thick binder in front of him. Julian took his seat at the opposite end, his face pale but his expression still defensive. His general counsel sat beside him, looking like a man who had already updated his resume: Neil. Franklin opened the binder and read the text of Article 7 aloud, his voice calm and clear. He did not yell, and he did not show anger. He simply let the legal language fill the room. When he finished, he looked directly at Julian. "Did you obtain the written consent of the majority investors before you signed the termination order for Owen Foster?" Neil asked. Julian cleared his throat. We had a board recommendation, Neil. The executive committee agreed that we needed to move forward with new leadership. The legal team assured us that the legacy agreements were superseded by the Series C filings. The legal team was wrong, Neil said, his voice dropping to a lower, harder register. The Series C documents amended the governance structure, but they explicitly preserved the founder IP protections. You fired the chief operating officer, who holds the personal rights to the database routing engine. Vertex Technologies has officially notified us that they are withdrawing their acquisition offer unless we can show clear title to the IP within 48 hours. They are not going to buy a lawsuit. Neil had spent 30 years protecting the interests of his fund, and he was not about to let a novice chief executive officer destroy a $220 million transaction because of a personal grudge. He was focused entirely on salvaging the merger, and Julian was now the only obstacle in his path. Julian tried to pivot. "We can offer Owen a settlement," he said, leaning forward. "We can give him 5% of the acquisition value. That is $11 million. He will sign the release." Neil looked at him with an expression of cold disappointment. "We already tried that, Julian." Owen's attorney rejected the offer. She informed us that Owen has no interest in negotiating with current management. He has offered to license the database routing engine back to Apex, but only under one condition: the immediate removal of Julian Vance for material breach of fiduciary duty and corporate negligence. The silence that followed was absolute. Julian looked at the other board members, searching for any sign of support, but he found only averted eyes and tight jaws. The same people who had voted to remove me 3 weeks ago were now calculating how to save their own investments. The deal with Vertex was the only way they would realize the value of their shares, and Julian was the only obstacle standing in the way of that deal. The board chairman stood up, adjusting his suit. "We will hold an executive session to discuss leadership realignment," he said. "Julian, please step out of the room." 2 hours later, the board issued an emergency statement. Julian Vance had been placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. The board had appointed Stuart Caldwell as the interim chief executive officer, with a mandate to resolve the intellectual property dispute and finalize the acquisition. The next morning, I received a formal licensing proposal from Apex's legal team, drafted under Neil Franklin's direct supervision. The terms were simple. They would pay my estate a licensing fee of 10% of the acquisition value, and I would receive a 3% equity stake in the combined entity, with an advisory role on the technical integration team. The total package was worth $30 million, and it did not require me to sign a non-disclosure agreement. I signed the agreement in Clara Mercer's office on Tuesday morning. As I walked out of the building, I felt no great sense of triumph or anger. I thought about the 12 years I had spent building Apex, the late nights, the cold coffee, and the lines of code that had held the platform together. I had built something that lasted, and when they tried to take it away, the law had protected the work of my hands. I drove back to my house, parked my sedan in the driveway, and walked into my kitchen to make a fresh cup of coffee. I sat down at the kitchen table, the morning sun warming the wooden floorboards. The yard outside was quiet, the winter frost starting to melt from the grass. For the first time in 12 years, my phone was completely silent, free of alerts, Slack notifications, and emergency system pages. I looked at the framed photograph on the counter, the one I had saved from my office, and felt a deep sense of completion. I had defended my work, secured my future, and walked away on my own terms. The empire they tried to build on my foundation was moving forward, but they would never forget the name of the man who laid the bricks. I had built a legacy with my hands, and no amount of corporate maneuvering could erase that truth. The future was open, and for the first time in my life, I was content to let it unfold without a plan.